All right, guys, I think we're going to get this thing started. The room filled up unbelievably quickly. I don't think I've ever seen this many people assemble in like 15 minutes, because we were upstairs wondering if folks were showing up, but this is great. Well, hello and welcome. I'm Mira Patney, Head of Global Communications at Semafor. Thank you for being with us this evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to Semafor's third event in our Trust in News series, and the first event since we launched, which is exactly 1 month ago today, so happy birthday to us. Was expecting a short applause from you there, Ben. Well, thank you. We made it. Well, through these events, we've been looking at the state of journalism across America, the blind spots, the tensions, and how to address some of our common crisis points. This evening, we're bringing together some of the smartest minds in media and politics as we examine the evolving relationship between journalism and the government. At the end of each session, we'll open the floor up for questions from the audience, so have those ready. And please look out for mic runners, they'll be on either side of the room. Our event is being live streamed today on semafor.com/events and on our Twitter and YouTube channels. Please use the Twitter hashtag Semafor News to join our conversation tonight. There'll be lots going on, hopefully. And before we begin, I was just saying hi to you guys. A special thank you to the Knight Foundation. We are so grateful for your partnership over this series and the data that you're providing to help inform our conversations today. In particular, going to shout out Ashley Zon, Alejandro De Onis, and Rebecca Dinar for their support. It's been a joy to work with you all. And to our Gallup hosts, thank you so much for your incredible hospitality. So let's kick things off. Our first guest is one of the finest political reporters in the country today. Maggie Haberman covers the White House for the New York Times. Her latest book, Confidence Man, details the making of President Trump and is no doubt set to become one of the most defining books on his presidency to date. She's joining us remotely from New York, and here to join her in conversation is Ben Smith, Semafor's co-founder and editor-in-chief. Ben, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks to our partners at Gallup for having us. Long time no see, Maggie. I last saw Maggie last night at a dinner in New York where all of the most important people in town were hanging on her every word, although, of course, this is Washington, so everyone here is more important. And Maggie, I guess, yes, and the book is fabulous, and we're thrilled to have you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
And I figured I'd just start with today's news, because one of the many reasons you should read Maggie's book is that much of it, the first half, I guess, is really about Donald Trump's life in New York in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And one of the recurring themes is state and local and federal investigations of Donald Trump in which he plays and repeatedly wins games of chicken with prosecutors. And today the Department of Justice announced that they're appointing a special counsel to decide whether or not to indict him. I'm curious how you see that in light of what you learned researching this book.
Sure. So first of all, again, thanks for having me, and thanks for having me on a computer as opposed to in person. I apologize for not being there. This seemed like yet another in a series of decades-long interactions, often involving gamesmanship by Trump with prosecutors or elected officials who are looking into him in some way. And it's interesting, Jack Smith, the special counsel who was named, has a very long history with investigations. That included having worked in the Brooklyn district, the Eastern District of New York, where, as a federal prosecutor, where Trump was investigated nearly 50 years ago on a possible fraud charge in relation to a real estate transaction. So it's just sort of amazing how everything kind of comes back to the same places with Trump. Trump is telling people he's not happy about this special counsel because, he has flashbacks to the Mueller investigation and how that dominated his presidency. He believes this will make things take longer. It's hard to imagine it shortens them. I don't think he has some special insight into this, but it is yet another, you could see a world then where this just drags things out for months and months and months and months and doesn't end in a prosecution and just sort of fades into the background. And the history of Donald Trump in New York is cultivating prosecutors, befriending prosecutors. When Mueller was appointed, he wanted literally to walk across the street and go talk to Mueller. He's not going to be able to do that here, and it's far different, to have a special counsel when he's not president this time. But it is just another recurring pattern in Donald Trump's life.
Yeah, do you think, in New York, really the pattern was him doing stuff that would have gotten other people indicted and not getting indicted. Is there some trick that he's going to be able to apply in this case?
I think there's probably actually a whole group of people in New York who were engaged in certain activities and didn't get investigated over time.
All of our sources over many years, yes.
No comment on that, but that's because this is, it is a world where, the Manhattan District Attorney of many years, Robert Morgenthau, was, part of the elite power structure. And, I don't know that he ever was given anything to investigate specifically to Donald Trump. I know of, people who claim to have been stiffed by Donald Trump, contractors, which there were many over the years, made some complaints to Morgenthau's office, and the office's feeling was we're not a collection agency. However, was always a whiff of corruption around Trump and allegations of mob ties and so forth. And so there were things to look into, and no one did. I don't know whether this ends up being yet another series of investigations that go nowhere. We're going to find out.
And I think I'd like to sort of stay in New York in the 80s for a minute here, because I think that one of the really interesting things about this book is the effort that I think is sort of out of fashion in journalism to really understand the person you're writing about, not treat them as a two-dimensional cable news figure, but really kind of like get to their psychological motivations and what makes them tick. And one of the things, so much has been written about this book. Many of you have probably read the book. One of my colleagues did not realize you were remote and brought it to be autographed. Sorry,
oh, no.
Sorry, Kadia. But one of the themes that I really struck me is Trump's interaction with women through the years. And there's this scene that I'm not going to read in full because this is a family event, but it's a fundraiser in the late 80s, and when the conversation somehow turned to Brazilian women, and he says something totally shocking at the table with a bunch of fancy people and his wife. And I guess I wonder if you could just sort of take what you learned and put it in context, really on that theme. Sure.
So I would say that there is the clear through line of his relationships with women and interactions with women that fall in the same broad category of every other relationship he has, which is that he needs to, dominate in some way or another. In the instance you're describing, which was a charity event where he and his then wife Ivana were attending, and his employee Tony Glideman had brought his wife, and Trump says something just incredibly crude to Glideman's wife, who just reacted with sort of shock. And part of why he says certain things is to shock. He's constantly sort of speaking in a very crude manner about sex, or about things of a sexual nature, but some of it is, appears to be about dominance. At the same time, one of the things that was striking about him when he was an executive in New York was that he did have a surprisingly what you would consider progressive record of having women executives around, in various roles. And as one person who worked for him said to me, no one else in New York was really at high levels was doing that at that time, other than sort of as tokens. So it's everything with him is that, for every example, there's a counterexample. He has a very long history of saying extremely crude and overt things to women. He's obviously been accused of a rape. He has been accused of sexual harassment over and over again. He's been accused of sexual misconduct. And he spent, years proudly sitting on Howard Stern's couch saying all kinds of things about women who he was dating, including his now wife. Which gets to the point, I guess, Ben, that when 2016 came around, probably no one should have been that surprised by the Access Hollywood tape, because it was in keeping with the pattern.
Right, Howard Stern viewers were not, or listeners were not as surprised.
We're not.
Let me ask you. I'm a media reporter, so let me ask you about writing a book. And we actually have some data that I was thinking about from our partners at Gallup and the Knight Foundation here, really about people's engagement with pay. If you could, Sydney, put up that data. It's sort of people's relationship with news and with paying for news, and this, basically, it shows the challenges of those of us who are in the paywall business, and really kind of the limits of people's willingness to pay, which obviously is very important, in long form news. But it occurs to me, of course, a book is like the ultimate paywall. You gotta show up at a store and hand over money. And I am curious, because you've really been in this whole spectrum of you've published a book. You've written for the New York Times, which is, a paywall publication. You're out on the open internet at Politico and on Twitter, where you're like exposed to all of the craziest things in the world at all times. And I am curious if like the sort of your approach to journalism and the way you think about your audience changes in a way based on how much the commitment that comes with, okay, I'm going to buy your book, okay, I'm paying for a New York Times subscription, versus like, I'm just here to yell at you for free on Twitter. Do you think, like, how does that sort of affect, and I guess particularly with the book?
You mean, I don't consider myself there to yell at people for free on Twitter. I actually generally just put stuff out if it's informative, or at least that's my goal. No, I don't think it's different. I actually think of these things all as of a piece, as part of journalism. I do think there's an expectation because of the early stages of the internet, the early years of the internet, when a lot of news content was free, and certainly Twitter is free. I think there is an expectation from segments of the readership that news should be free, and in an ideal world, information would all be free, but we don't live in that world, and there is a world where producing quality journalism costs money. I see books as, as part of that. Books are journalism, but the way I approach it doesn't change depending on what the audience is. I can do a sort of, joking around tweet in a way that I can't do in a newspaper. But I can also, do analysis in a book that I can't necessarily do in the pages of the Times, or that I wouldn't do on Twitter, because there's no room for nuance there.
What's as somebody who had to like kind of step out of this just all-encompassing news cycle, to step back and step way back in time to write this book, what surprised you most about kind of where you found yourself at the end, about about the process, about stepping back?
So I think the thing that was stepping back was hard for me just as a process. It was in general hard because I'm so hardwired to the daily news cycle. So that was, getting myself out of it was difficult, and took some time, and took a level of discipline that I'm not sure I ever entirely achieved, but tried to have, and with varying degrees of success. In terms of what I was looking for in the arc of this book, and sort of what the step back was to try to show the world that Trump came from, and how much of that world, and sort of what, and who he is, that he exported to Washington, and how much that trickled down to the Republican Party. What I found as I was stepping back and going, doing a lot of interviews and reading Wayne Barrett's, but Wayne Barrett, who was the progenitor of all Trump coverage, basically, wrote the first real Trump biography, and was, I would say, unique in the sense that, he didn't treat Trump as if he was, a Kennedy, and he didn't treat Trump as if he was a joke. He actually treated him as if he was a serious power player in New York City, which at times he was, until he had his collapse in 1990, 1991, and then he, spent the next decade trying to write the tale of a comeback. But the thing that I was struck by was just the rigid consistency of this guy over many, many, many decades. The Donald Trump that you see now is the same person that you saw in the late 1970s. Whatever growth is taking place is at a level that we are not seeing. Literally telling us, a story to me in an interview at Mar-a-Lago in March of 2021 that was almost identical to a story he told Lois Romano in 1984 for a piece she did for the Style section. The complaints are all the same. The victimization is all the same. I was very struck the other night in his announcement in Florida when he said, "I'm a victim." And I was surprised that he actually said it that way. I think a lot of members of his party wished he hadn't said it. But he had and he gave an interview to the Washington Times in the 1990s when he was in the middle of his attempted comeback, and he said, "I see myself," I'm paraphrasing, but "I see myself as a very honest person in a very corrupt world." And, that is sort of the worldview. So that's what I was trying to show.
Yeah, gosh, it sounds like, you're talking about sort of writing a biography without what's sort of like typically considered the basic ingredient, which is like a character arc.
There's the arc is sort of flat, but the arc, such as it is a changing world that eventually sort of meets him where he is in terms of how he approaches life, as opposed to how it had been approached for a long time.
Yeah, that kind of brings me to a question about particularly about the contemporary Republican Party and contemporary American politics, which you hear debated constantly, which is, was Donald Trump an anomaly who hijacked the Republican Party, took it in a new direction, but that ultimately, when he's gone, Trumpism is gone. Everything that he was a totally singular figure, versus was he the totally logical outgrowth of a decade of partisanship and culture? And I guess I'm curious. I mean, maybe it's phrased always as this kind of binary debate, but I'm curious where you come out on that.
Yeah, I don't think it's a binary. I mean, I think that these things are not mutually exclusive. And I think two things can be true at once and are. I think that Trump is a singular figure only because there is no other figure who had been part of the pop culture fabric for so many decades, and with whom so many voters identified from having seen him on TV over many, many years. I write in the book about how, I was interviewing caucus goers in Iowa in January of 2016, shortly before the caucuses, and asking a pretty leading question at one of his rallies, which was basically, are you here because the spectacle is ending? And they kept telling me they were caucusing for him, including one man who looked at me like I had 8 heads and said I watched him run his business. And he meant The Apprentice. And so I don't think it was clear, particularly to sort of the more insular New York, D.C. Media world that in 2016, just how formed opinions were of Trump based on The Art of the Deal and then based on The Apprentice, which really was based on The Art of the Deal. But I don't think there's another figure who would have had universal name recognition and was seen as this, titan of riches, regardless of what Trump's actual financial circumstances are. That was the perception. But that said, I don't think the party would have elected a Trump had there not been the Tea Party and the reaction to the fiscal crisis and to Obama's election in 2008. And, I think Trump seized on that. He didn't create it, but he seized on it and he fueled it and benefited from that fuel. And there was this enormous era of mistrust that began to occur in our politics, honestly, beginning late 1990s, but all the way through the fiscal crisis, that Trump was perfectly suited for. And so I think both things are true.
One of the questions that, I think everybody who's written a book about the last our recent history has been asked, is how did you think about, you had a piece of hot news, I think sometimes interpreted on social media as the final silver bullet that would change everything, but at least a pretty good story. And you had to wait for the publication of a book, and we all had to wait for the publication of a book. And how did you sort of balance your responsibility to the book, your responsibility to the Times, your inability to sit on a piece of news characterologically? How did you kind of approach that? So
I was in touch with my editors throughout the process, and my editors of the newspaper, throughout the process of writing the book, and I shared considerable...
We're not allowed to name the newspaper since I left, but...
A newspaper is the only one. I shared considerable information with them throughout the process. I turned to this project in earnest, Ben, after the second impeachment trial ended in February of 2021, and I kept thinking that I was going to get time to work on this book. I actually had planned to really start working on it during the transition, but then that couldn't happen because he, wouldn't leave, and he was holding these meetings in the Oval Office, which was a story that I broke in real time, and so forth and so on. My goal is always to get confirmed, reportable information in print as soon as possible, but the process of a book is different, and a lot of this stuff took time to confirm. So, and much of it, in addition to sharing with my editors, we put out in the paper well before the publication. You came up with the New York Post, which last week published sort of a bar at the bottom of the page that said, Florida man makes announcement, page 26, and had a 300-word mocking blurb on page 26. A post-staff report.
Right, post-staff report. Think that's getting to him? Do you think that bothers him?
I do, but I also think that the Post and Donald Trump have been in some kind of a dance for 40 years, and I don't think this is the end of it. Actually, I guess just over 30. I don't think this is the end of it. No, 40 years. I think that this does bother him. I think that Rupert Murdoch knows better than anybody that to not say Donald Trump's name is the biggest insult you can give him, and I have an anecdote to that effect at the beginning of the book. But that said, will this hold if he's the nominee? I think that's the big question.
And I guess, the 2 minutes remaining us, I figure I've got to ask you, he did in fact announce, the coverage broadly mirrored the Post. Like he got kind of a shrug. The event was kind of rambling and honestly kind of boring. What's going on? Like, is he just going to fizzle out? Does he really want to do this?
I don't think his heart is quite in this. It might get in it again. I think it's actually pretty telling that the way he has to get attention is to give a teleprompter speech. And that sort of speaks about where we're at. In 2020, he did a rally, and in 2016, he came down the escalator at Trump Tower and ripped up his speech. Look, I think he wants to be president again. I don't know that he wants to campaign again. I also would not predict that he's going to fizzle out. I think that the lesson of the book you're holding in your hand is obituary gets political and otherwise gets written prematurely over and over again. I do think something feels a little different this time, but we'll see.
And what about you? You just published, look at the page, 500.
8,000 pages.
An 8,000-page biography, first volume, of Donald Trump. Are you gonna get back? Are you gonna leap back on the Trump train? Will we be seeing you at Mar-a-Lago?
I expect I will be involved in coverage, but it will not look like it did for the last 6 years, 7 years,
Well,
8 years. Yeah.
What's it gonna look like?
Don't know. Stay tuned.
And and genuinely, do you anticipate a volume 2?
It's a good question. I don't. But ask me again in 2 years. My current plan is that this is my Trump book, and that's that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Maggie.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Maggie and Ben. Well, we've talked a lot about polarization at these events, and our next two panels examine the same question from two different perspectives. Is America drifting towards two separate ecosystems? Joining us for the first conversation is Jason Miller. Jason has worked as a former advisor to the Trump campaign and is now the CEO of Getter, a social media platform aimed at rejecting political censorship. And joining him on stage is Semafor's editor-in-chief, Steve Clemons. Steve, over to you.
Ben Smith is still alive, so I'm editor-at-large, but thank you for the promotion. I hope you're all reading Principles. Jason, do you subscribe to Principles?
Of course.
No, thank you. So I will interview anyone who is subscribed to Semafor Principles. I also want to do a nice shout-out to a friend, Adam Frisch, who just conceded to Lauren Boebert. So as we talk about this topic of two different worlds, two different sets of media, but one of the most closely watched districts in the undone area was Colorado 3, and he came within a sliver. I don't know why you didn't wait for the recount, but that's a whole other topic. But Jason, the topic here today, really want to start out with the question that Ben just asked Maggie. Do you think there's going to be a volume 2?
Of course. Look how many books she sold. I don't think anyone in the Haberman family is going to have to worry about paying for college for a couple generations.
Yeah.
Of course there'll be another book.
So our topic, we talked about today was going to be, is America destined for two news ecosystems? Two sets of gravitational forces and planets in terms of news there. Part of our task today is to look at what healthy democracy, healthy media, healthy oversight of government, and healthy respect of government for the media should look like. So tell us, are we going to have two ecosystems?
I think we're already there. I think if you looked at the way that folks in the center-right consume news and the way that folks in the center-left consume news, completely different. The way the social media activity, you can see the way it's played out with Elon Musk of late after he took over Twitter, and then people are freaking out and quitting Twitter and doing different things.
Are you guys friends?
I would like to be friends. I mean, he goes on better vacations than I do, I can tell you that. But no, he might not view me as a competitor. I'd like to be a competitor, though. But I think we're already there. The separation has already happened where you have two separate ecosystems, and I think we're going to be at a real pivotal point over the next 4 or 5 years here. Do media outlets on both sides, whether it be conservative, whether it be more left of center, or mainstream outlets who say they don't have any aspect of bias, do brands decide that they want to have a presence in both camps, whether you're on the left or the right, and also do candidates decide that they want to reach out, candidates and elected officials, and communicate with all their constituents or all voters. And I do think that as we move toward a non-biased political approach to where we aren't picking winners and losers, that we can get things more to where there's more conversation and dialogue. But ultimately, some of this split isn't bad for the simple fact that decentralization in free speech is good. Now, obviously, I worked for President Trump 2016 and 2020. I have a very formed opinion about the Hunter Biden laptop, for example. But the way that you could have a couple of outlets, whether a couple of media outlets or a couple of social media outlets, pick what stories are going to be covered or not, I think is bad for democracy. I think decentralization, giving people more options when it comes to free speech, is a good thing. But again, whether it be candidates and elected officials, brands and media outlets, I think it behooves them to have a presence both in center-left and center-right platforms.
Do you believe President Biden won the election?
I mean, President Biden, 44,000 votes over 3 states. So he's the, hopefully it's just the one term.
But beyond that issue, you know, I think one of the interesting questions that I think a lot of Americans have on whatever side of the political aisle, what does accuracy in media mean? And I know you, and you and I have talked offline about the importance of serious content, and not to put words in your mouth, dealing with the crazies, looking at content moderation in smart ways, accuracy in journalism and in media. What does accuracy in media mean on the conservative side of the equation?
Well, I think accuracy in media, number one, you don't have one sole arbiter of the truth. That's why I think there's a bit of a misnomer with the fact checkers, because everybody comes with an inherent bias. I think to the aspect where there's community policing, I think is important, in addition to, say, the AI moderation and the human moderators that we have. The community policing aspect is important, but I think also having a number of viewpoints, because 2 separate news outlets can cover the exact same event.
Well, that's what Semafor is doing. You know, when we put a Semafor out there, we put the scoop, we put the writer's view, and then we put a disagreement in. Is that the kind of thing that might work in the conservative media environment to kind of get back to people understanding, rather than bandwagoning one view and harassing another view, that they entertain?
Well, I do think that's important, and that's why we've made a strong effort to try to bring people from the center-left onto the platform, whether it be people who are journalists.
Who are your center-left stars?
We have a number of, I don't want to call them stars because I don't want them to leave the platform. I want them to get shamed by being on Getter and being active. But we do have a number of folks in the center left, and we're looking to hire more. Maybe there are even some from Twitter who are quitting and looking to go to a new opportunity. Same thing with Facebook. But I think it's important to present both sides. And also, I think when it comes to social media, it's critical that when we're looking at content, that we're not picking winners and losers based on ideology. Obviously, if something is threatening harmful speech, if it's doxing, if it's purposely pushing fake news, things of that nature, then that would violate our terms of service, and it would be taken down. But if it's simply someone's political opinion and it's not violating one of those principles in our terms of service, I might not agree with it, whether it be on the left or on the right, but that doesn't mean it should come down.
You know, sometimes I think we fake this bipartisan, shtick with putting a Republican up and a Democrat up, when the divisions within the parties are much more interesting than the divisions between the 2 parties. And right now, if you're honest, you sort of see this battle between Donald Trump and Rupert Murdoch. Who's going to win?
I think that for all of the tension, I think Maggie was right that there's a bit of a dance that's going on there. Ultimately, Trump sells a lot of papers. He sells a lot of ads. You guys probably saw the ratings that came about, and I'm sure there are a lot of folks at MSNBC who probably wish that maybe their network covered the president's speech on Tuesday because CNN beat him. CNN was in 2nd place on Tuesday night. MSNBC was in 3rd. That's the type of thing where I think it's smart.
Did you see Fox kept cutting away?
They cut away for about 10 minutes, and then they came back. So they cut away for 10 minutes. I'll give them the pass.
Okay.
I'll give them the pass on that. CNN, credit where credit's due. CNN covered about 20, 25 minutes up through the announcement. I think MSNBC should have covered it. And the same thing, I think when President Biden announces for re-election, I think Fox, CNN, MSNBC, other news outlets should be covering that live. It's an important event.
So I think one of the interesting things going on is the fragmentation of media everywhere, and we see it in Semafor, how we're looking at, where are our readers, what are they looking at, what are their 2nd, 3rd, 4th choices. In conservative land, and I know we have some folks in conservative land here, where do they get their news right now? Because there seems to be a migration, or at least some tension about Fox News. Who are the contenders to Fox in the broadcast space, or who are the big players that are emerging in the conservative news ecosystem that impress you?
In addition to Fox, you have Newsmax, who I used to be a contributor to, not anymore, but they're in the television space as well. You have a number of the print outlets. But I think folks, even in the center right, try to get as much of a broad-based news as they can. But I think in many cases, and look, conservative outlets and conservative users, I think, are guilty of this as well. Too often, you won't see conservative outlets making a push on traditional social media platforms with the same effort they do in center-right platforms. Vice versa. So I think it's great that Semafor, for example, has an account on Getter. Now, I got to get you active. That's kind of my next step. It sounds like Elon Musk saying.
Yes, please follow the Semafor account on Getter, which I just learned we had.
Yes. So it's, but I think that's great because you have to make the effort to reach all constituencies. And I think that there's a particular...
And some people need to escape the boat they're on because it's sinking. So now we have a new boat, Mira. So let's fill it up. Let me ask you, you're one of the most quoted people on the inside circle of Donald Trump's political operation. You came out and encouraged the former president not to announce his run until after the Georgia runoff. We saw an election where I think most analysts looked at it and said the last-minute surprise was Donald Trump back on the scene, and there was sort of a rejection by a lot of folks of that in the view of some analysts. Do you think it was a mistake for Donald Trump not to listen to your advice?
He ended up being right. I'll tell you why on this point.
Really? Or are you just being nice?
No, hold on. Yeah. The one cool thing about President Trump is that, and this might be a bit of a misnomer, he actually listens to pushback and advice. He also has no problem telling you if he thinks that you're wrong or if you're an idiot. So I've been on the receiving end of that one as well. I said wait until after the Georgia runoff because it could be control of the Senate. At that point, we were still waiting on Arizona and Nevada. His pushback at the time was we need some good news coming out of the midterms. Yes, we won back the House. We came up short in a couple Senate races. This will be more energy and more enthusiasm going into the Georgia runoff. And besides, I'm ready to go. I want to go after Joe Biden. Let's go and get this started. Ended up being a moot point, the reason why I brought it up or suggested holding it off, because we lost in Arizona and Nevada. And so ultimately it landed to the place of the concern that I had. But again, he told me I was wrong on that one.
So how do you handle, I mean, you've been on different sides of the media angle. You've been a political consultant, communications director. And I guess the thing that gets me is that President Trump is a bundle of contradictions, no surprise there. He talks to he calls Maggie Haberman, who's written a pretty harsh treatment. He calls Bob Woodward, he calls Jonathan Swan. He's calling these people, right? They're not getting the leaks from staff, they're getting the leaks from him. And yet he's beating them up and saying fake news. And, I'm just wondering what he thinks and what you think the package does as the message to a young person growing up today about the role of media in democracy.
Well, I think for Republican candidates, President Trump and others and elected officials clearly need to do a much better job with younger voters. I mean, you see what happened in the midterms, where Democrats did a fantastic job at turning out younger voters. Republicans did a terrible job. And you look at the trend of younger voters, I believe it's by 2024 that millennials will have surpassed baby boomers for a number of overall raw voters who are turning out. That's a concern if we don't get our act together and start making a stronger push.
A lot of people in response to President Trump, in fact, a lot of Republican conservatives, Team Trump folks have said that they wish he would stop talking about the past and talk about the future. Any chance of that?
Look at Tuesday night's speech.
And it's a long speech. It's still getting through it.
A long speech. Yeah. It's a couple of minutes longer than drafted, but he snuck a couple extra pages in. But I know Maggie referred to it as being boring. I refer to it as being very focused. I thought he actually gave a forward-looking vision. One of the things about this speech with the goals going in, President Trump really hadn't had that long of an opportunity in one setting to deliver a speech, probably since the Republican convention in 2020. Coming off of whether it be January 6th, the second impeachment trial, the J6 hearings, everything that's gone on over the last couple of years, it was important for him to come out and give a very forward-looking where he wanted to go. Now, of course, he added a little bit of liveliness into it. Of course, that's what he's always going to do. He doesn't want to be the boring suit. But I thought he, for people who are the sometimes Trump voter, I thought he did a good job of saying he's going to work on the reverse the decline of America, the economy, energy independence, things like that. But if you notice the focus, we used a lot of the rhetorical devices such as this will be your campaign, I'm going to be your voice. A lot of the anti-Washington thematics that were in there sounded a lot more like 2016 than 2020, and I think his core base will be energized by that.
So tell us a little bit about Getter. If I begin to get more active and we have a Semafor page, are we going to be swarmed like by, velociraptors around us in that space? I mean, what kind of climate are you really trying to create? You told me you're doing a comedy show, which
We are.
I found
And
surprising. I didn't, I'm just wondering if the comedians are any good.
So really had two goals when I launched Getter. One, to make sure the technology was good, and we weren't just aiming to be a center-right competitor in the microblogging space to Twitter. Want to ultimately expand into comedy, sports, a lot of additional content to where there's no ideological aspect. It's just a support of free speech. Other thing was to make it a global platform. And the great thing about Getter, we're only 48% US, 52% international now. So we've put our money where the mouth is. About 18% of our user base is in Brazil, about 10% is in the UK. We have our first ever comedy night coming up Monday, first ever World Cup event in London this next Friday with Matt Letitia, for any British football fans who are out there, the pride of Southampton. But that's really where we're going. We have, obviously, though, there's that political energy to start, but people are looking for new platforms, looking for new user experiences. I think for all the attention with Musk and with Twitter, the issue, I'm surprised as an innovator, he hasn't spent more time on trying to improve the user experience. I mean, Twitter, go and get some breaking news, but, and I'm a competitor, it's boring. There's just the microblogging. He doesn't have the short video format that younger folks want to see. Doesn't have the live streaming feature, at least not in the same way that that we do, or even YouTube or other outlets. And I think if Musk was putting his focus on the innovation side, there might be a chance. But I think the brand might be just too badly damaged.
Do you think Twitter will be around in a month?
Boy, if I had an answer to that, I'd go to Vegas right now and bet on, put some future bets on the Super Bowl or NBA championship.
But how does it look to you? And I mean, you're a CEO of a social media company. I know it's smaller, but do you have any concerns about the judgment calls he's making?
I think that success doesn't necessarily transfer from one victory to the next. So success in creating a company in your image is different from a takeover and pulling a Jack Welch or Mitt Romney and trying to come up with a turnaround, because it's not the vehicle that you created. I think in particular the going into a company that maybe doesn't pride themselves as being hardcore and asking them if they're going to be hardcore as well, probably going to be taken the wrong way. But I'm sure that the people who are at SpaceX or Boring Company or Tesla probably view themselves as hardcore because he built them all from the ground up.
There are a lot of books that have come out recently about President Trump. Maggie's book, Confidence Man, or Peter Glasser and Susan Baker's book, The Divider. I think Mike Pence has a new book out. Are any of these books your favorites?
So I think I've read a good chunk of them. I'll tell you where the ones that I think, without beating up on anyone in particular.
Yeah.
I think the ones that are better reads are the ones that actually are more of novels that tell a story. I think some of the journalists in their books fell into a trap of essentially a collection of daily stories, and they kind of read like a whole bunch of daily stories. Some folks did it better than others, but there have been some good ones, but I don't want to give them any credit or have them think that I actually like their books. I'll just keep that to myself.
And then just finally, because I think that the other group that was punished in this election were those people who were really holding on to this election deniers. Is there an equivalent on the litmus test on the Republican side, looking at Democrats, looking at my friend Adam Frisch or something, of something like that? I mean, it's not happened in American politics before where we've seen so many people look at one issue like election deniers. We see that really frustrate a lot of independents and moderates. But on the Republican and even the moderate Republican side, is there something else out there that basically is a litmus test that matters to them?
I think the litmus test, well, that's a tough question because the Republican Party is a bit fractured right now. The Republican Party has been beaten up. Yes, there are the victories of retiring Nancy Pelosi, for example, which we're very happy about, but lost the Senate and probably should have won the Senate. I think what the Republican Party really failed to do after 2020 was figure out the vote modeling and vote targeting, ultimately the vote turnout. The Democrats did very well, particularly when it comes to early voting and also the mobilization of voters moved by the Dobbs decision. Republicans didn't match that, didn't catch that. So I think Republicans are hungry for a victory. They've seen the first 2 years of the Biden administration, clear they're not happy with the inflation and the results. I don't know if there's one necessary litmus test, but things will sort itself out. The Republican Party, just like the Democratic Party, has gone through growing pains in the past. But I think that right now, probably the worst thing to say is the old Reagan adage of "I'm from Washington and I'm here to help." That's probably the worst place that you want to be right now. And that's quite frankly why you look at President Trump, even the news today with the special counsel. If you didn't know any better, it'd be as if these guys never saw 2016. They never saw 2020. Going after President Trump 3 days after he launches his campaign is silly. People, it looks very political. Obviously, I'm biased. I'm a Trump partisan. It looks very political. The fact that you have folks like Ken Griffin and Steve Schwartzman coming out and attacking Donald Trump is helping Donald Trump. The last thing you want is Steve Schwartzman or Ken Griffin's endorsements. That's bad in a Republican race.
Well, I want to tell you, we're live on C-SPAN right now, and C-SPAN basically always has 1/3 of its audience, you know, in the conservative side, 1/3 if it's in the very liberal, 1/3 of the independent. So 1/3 of the audience is just cheering right now, you know, in their hearts at homes at C-SPAN. I don't know about the rest, but Jason Miller, CEO of Getter, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. I'm going to stay here, right?
Yeah, Steve, you're staying put, and I guess we have to check out Semafor on Getter. Follow us there as well. Well, thank you, Jason. Joining us now on stage are two former government spokespeople to offer a different side. Please welcome Simone Sanders, former chief spokesperson for Vice President Kamala Harris, and now host of our own show, Simone, on MSNBC. And actually joining us virtually is Joe Lockhart, former Clinton White House press secretary, and now the managing director of the communications firm Rational 360. Back to you, Steve.
Oh, terrific. Thank you. Joe, if you were here, I would have given you a kiss, too. Good to see you. And Simone, thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on your show.
Thank you.
Joe, thank you for joining us from far away. And I also want to say, because I'm not one of those people that's overly worried about, you know, TikTok and information, but I'm sure I'll get educated. You're the best TikToker. You're absolutely. I called your staff and I said, "Who does your TikTok videos?" And she says, "You know, I do." So if you're on TikTok, follow Simone, and then follow me. I'm going to learn how to do it too. So let me just start out and ask you. I think today we're trying to have some fun. It's a Friday evening here. Lots of people have shown up. The room is packed. And we're talking about healthy democracy. We're talking about media and government. And in the first 2 episodes of this that we did with the support from the Knight Foundation and our friends at Gallup, we focused in on journalists talking to other journalists about what journalism should do. And I'm sort of interested in getting the perspective. You are on the journalistic side now, but you were on the other side. You dealt with all of us. You helped, cajole us, seduce us. And since you're here, let me ask Joe. I mean, you work for a complicated man, Joe. You work for President Clinton, and you know I could have President Clinton and you know to some degree President Trump on the stage and say, you know, tell us what accuracy means to you. But I would love to kind of get your sense, knowing both sides of this equation. What are the deficits that you see? Let's critique both sides. What are the deficits in our industry when it comes to covering the White House, Joe?
Well, you know, I think the biggest criticism I'd have of coverage is people getting wedded to a particular narrative. Biden is a failure because he didn't get his big bill passed. The Republicans are, whatever. And rather than looking at what happens day to day and what meaningful things happen, I think it's narrative, and I think it's story selection. I mean, the country faces enormous challenges, which does not have a Democrat or Republican solution that's obvious. And a lot of those issues tend to get ignored in the political coverage. There's certainly coverage of climate, in major newspapers. Right. But when you're looking at just people who are covering the politics of Washington, it tends to be issues that at the end of the day are not that important, but they feed into this narrative that's very hard to shake. The narrative, I look at political narratives like a super tanker or a cruise ship. It really takes a lot to move it in a different direction. Sometimes it takes a storm, and I think the midterms provided a storm because the Democrats did much better than expected. And now the narrative is that Joe Biden has the wind at his back. Republicans are in disarray. All of these things didn't change on election day, but that's my criticism, my primary criticism of how things get covered.
I want to bold and underline what Joe just said. We saw it play out in the midterm elections. These folks, I'm not going to name any names, but kept talking about a red wave coming. There was nothing in the data to support a red wave. There was everything in the data and the real lived experience of what we saw from Kansas, the referendum, from New York 19. I'm from Nebraska, honey. There are not enough Democrats in Kansas to defeat that referendum. There were Republicans that voted for that. But this idea that abortion was not a quote-unquote kitchen table issue, right? Maybe not at your kitchen table, but at many kitchen tables across the country, it was. But I do believe that there were so many people in the media apparatus who were wed to this idea of conventional wisdom that they could not see what was happening in front of them. Any reporter, anybody, any strategist that spent time on the ground over the last 6 months, heck, 3 months, heck, a week before Election Day, could have told you that what we were talking about on television didn't really dovetail with the energy and the facts on the ground.
So, Simone, you and Jen Psaki, so two great communications directors at the White House, are now on MSNBC shows. Is there a problem, in your perspective, that there is, not just with MSNBC, but a bubble that is developed there that's mutually reinforcing? Should we not be reaching out to communities that are not part of that ecosystem?
I don't know if I understand the question. The idea that because I worked at the White House, I somehow don't understand communities outside of the Beltway. I'm a bald millennial black woman from North Omaha, Nebraska, who, did not ever dream of working at a White House, let alone having her own show. I am not, the cookie cutter Washington, D.C. demographic. And so I think also, let's just be honest, George Stephanopoulos also used to work at the White House. Someone would not suggest that he cannot cover the story.
Right.
And so I think what we should be focused on here is the facts.
Right.
When you tune into my show on Saturdays and Sundays or streaming on Peacock, do I tell the truth? Do I present a multifaceted story? Do I challenge what it is that we all think we know? And I would venture to say the answer is yes. I have Republicans on my show. Why? Because I don't believe that everyone in America should be a Democrat. I don't believe that everyone should be or is a progressive. And I do think that there is something that we can learn and glean from some of my Republican friends.
I do that. Joe, I would love to get your sense, too, of this ecosystem as we sort of think about patterns and habits we should be thinking out, on the journalistic side, on the, social and civil society side. What are things, I actually watch Simone's show regularly, and I know what she says is right. I also know in the first, just to put a little plug in, Semafor principals, Tuesday morning of the election, said maybe we ought not to go there. Remember the Harry Truman picture holding up the Dewey wins picture. I said, keep that in mind as the day goes on. And that proved to be a better metaphor for what was going on. But I'm interested in, Joe, in your insights. You were also a major communications company executive. I think that trust in institutions have just collapsed. And, sometimes trust can be rebuilt by people getting back to not trusting when they'll have to rethink everything. But what do you suggest we do by way of better patterns?
Well, I was taken a little bit by something Jason Miller said in the last segment, where he talked about how it's hard to take seriously fact-checking because everyone brings a bias to it. There is a bias. There's a bias toward people who want to be held to the truth and people who don't. That's the bias. So I think starting there, one of the huge problems I think media organizations struggled with Trump was, how do they balance letting him talk, and then how do they put the toothpaste back in the tube? Because they know what he's saying is not true. And I don't know that anyone has come up with a solution for that. I think on the, former White House people or political people or shows or networks that, lean one way or the other. There's lots of choices out there. The internet has sort of flattened the hierarchy of journalism and political, discussion in the country. And I don't know that there's been enough to help people curate that. And people tend to just then drift toward people who agree with them. And they want to watch shows or read things that reinforce what they already believe. And so I think those two things are the biggest challenges. I think most media organizations are really struggling with these issues. And I don't know that we've really seen a good answer yet.
Well, I think we're going to show a short clip in a few minutes of my interview yesterday with Amy Klobuchar about the state of local news in the country, what's been going on in the dynamic. But before I do that, I'd like to ask our folks to put up just very quickly 2 slides that come out of a study done by the Knight Foundation and Gallup. And in it, it's complex. So I'm just saying the top line here, really what it says is most news organizations are first and foremost businesses motivated by financial interests and goals. That's this side. Here's the notion that most news organizations are motivated by serving the public interest and playing a role as a civic institution. And that used to be the sort of way we would think about the tensions in media. But when you look at it, 83%, that number 76 is wrong, but 83% overall Americans have a view that it's really about bucks. It's about money, dollars, financial interests. And a little bit of difference between Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, but that is, Simone, isn't, and let's put up the next one quick. Let's get through these real quick. We have views of news organizations perceived by age group, which is very interesting.
What do the young people say?
The young people are really cool. They doubt, they're skeptical of everything. Essentially, this is interesting because when you say who leans most towards staying in business, who has a balance between business and serving the public well, who leans towards public service, as you look at the media in the aggregate, and you see that the biggest doubt is in the millennial category. Essentially, those that believe that it's most balanced are the 77 plus, so those people that are very familiar with the traditional institution. Now, I don't think it can go back in time, but as you go forward, as you go to youth and you go to this, you see the fragmented media, Simone. You're brilliant on TikTok and MSNBC, in my view. And in that case, what can we do? What are the replicable lessons about healthy democracy that ought to be instilled in this? Because what I'm reading in this is a lot of doubt in our industry.
Yes, and there's a lot of doubt in institutions overall. I know Gallup is the gold standard, but they and the Pew Center for Research, they track trust in public institutions, not just from young people, but folks overall. And you look at trust in Congress and Supreme Court, in government overall, the presidency, it is low among young people especially. And part of that is because young people, especially millennials, I'm millennial, I'm 32 years old. When the first year I could vote, Barack Obama was on the ballot. And since that time, think about all of the things the young people that are as old as I am have seen. Think about the generation younger than me. Okay, those young folks, instead of doing fire drills in school, they're doing gun drills about how to shelter in place and keep themselves alive. And if you tell young people, millennials like myself, they have been voting. And so they've been voting, yet all of these things keep happening. It's a misnomer that young people are not engaged. Young people swung this election for the Democratic Party. Look at the data in key states from Wisconsin to Pennsylvania to Arizona. So I guess I would say that you have to demonstrate to young people that they have to be a part of the system to believe in it. They've lost faith in a system that they do not think can change anything for them. I believe in the system because I've been a part of it. Right? I know that participation changes things. I have seen my participation through politics in government make a difference in our country. Not every young person in America can say that. And so we have to do the business of bridging that gap between participation and trust and not just speaking at young people, but really listening to them.
Let me ask you both, and Joe, you have one of the criticisms of this White House, you were part of this White House before, was that they're just really bad at marketing their accomplishments. That when you look at the,
I think Democrats as a whole.
yeah, well, I mean, you kind of like at all the things that were passed, which were considerable, in basically a split Senate from the, American Recovery Act, CHIPS Act, so many other, acts that were passed, veterans support, et cetera. And you were in a different White House. So, Joe, would you critique the Biden White House for a minute on its marketing skills and its inability in the eyes of some to get its message out? What was the Biden team getting wrong? And then I'll give you a chance to give your view.
I don't know that they're getting a lot wrong. I mean, I think my president, Bill Clinton, was a much better salesperson than most Democratic presidents, most Democratic politicians. I'd say the same thing about Barack Obama. But there have been a lot of accomplishments, but part of the problem is, and I don't want to turn all of this on the media because the White House clearly could do better. But I think the media, and particularly the young people in the media, grew up in the Trump administration, and they grew up in a culture that was so combative, and so they can't do anything right. That is very hard for the White House to get a message out, a consistent message. And I think the things that the media chooses to focus on are often not the things that people in the country are interested in. Nor are they the real problems, the fundamental problems of the country. So I think it's very hard to get through that filter. Now, the good news in all of this is, from the time I started doing this to now, there's 1,000 ways to get around that filter and get your own message out. And TikTok is obviously one of them. All the social media platforms. You don't have to go through cable news or the major newspapers. But they still have an impact, and I think often what we judge is, well, what did we see on cable news that day? Here's what I'd say about the criticism of the criticism,
right?
Which is, look what happened at the midterms. The voters got it. They understood the difference between Democrats and Republicans. They understood the difference between being committed to solving problems and denying elections and being interested in investigations. So I think, there really is a very fractured way now of marketing in politics. And inside the Beltway, that's not always recognized.
Simone, what do you think about how the Democrats sold their package? Are there things that they need to up their game on?
I mean, I think, first of all, I agree with Joe. I do not, obviously, I think that the Democratic Party apparatus as a whole could do better. One example is, instead of talking about the American Rescue Plan or the bipartisan infrastructure law, we should describe it as talking about the pieces of what it does. So, because bipartisan infrastructure law, what is that?
Right.
But if you tell me X amount of dollars for public safety in my community, X amount of, this is going to mean a new wing at LaGuardia, that is something that I can identify with. And I think that the Democratic Party apparatus got better at doing that as the months went on in the lead up to the midterm election. But this idea that the White House is not talking about their accomplishments or Democrats aren't talking about their accomplishments is not true. The accomplishments isn't what's going to get you on television. Okay, so if someone wants to come on and talk about this bill that they passed or this thing that Congress just did for the community, it's like, great, but are you going to take this Newsy Day question about Donald Trump and what's your view on the special counsel? Okay, like I know because I have to ask those questions now, but I am also interested in the other thing because I realize that the other thing is what other people care about. When I worked at the White House, we had a very laser focus on new media, but also local media. So when I traveled with the vice president, when she would go and do something, if she's touting the child tax credit, we're going to go and we're going to do local press talking about the child tax credit. And you know what? We're going to get a straight up write-up in the local newspaper and a straight up local television interview about this thing that the White House did and what the vice president said. No spin, no zhuzh on top, just the facts.
Let me ask you, finally, I don't want to go to just very quickly for a couple of questions from the audience, but when I look at my friend Adam Frisch, who's sitting here, he just conceded in Colorado 3 to Lauren Boebert.
I will say for democracy, I was very happy to see Adam Frisch competitive.
Yeah, very, very, very close. Adam Frisch, I'm gonna say something, Adam, because I reported the story. Didn't get a call back from the DCCC. They were never interested. Didn't get any of the stockpiles of money here for that race. Raised his own money. Came with an eyelash of winning. I think the question I want to ask is, in the Democratic Party, is there space for the Adam Frisches? Is there space for the Joe Manchins? Is there, I know you're a big tent person, but is the party itself big enough tent to bring in those folks that, his district has, 25% Dem? So he had to get Republicans to donate and support him. And whenever you see that, I'm just interested in the internal tensions in the party.
Well, I will say quickly, I think there is room for a Joe Manchin because he's still in the party.
Yeah.
I think in Adam Frisch's case, and I do not purport to speak for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, but these committees have to make choices about where folks can be competitive. And I think that there is something to be said about a retrospect look at post-midterms where Democrats thought that they could be competitive and then where they actually ended up being competitive, right?
Right.
Adam Frisch is an example. Sherry Beasley in North Carolina is an example.
Right.
That was a very winnable Senate race for Democrats, and I think that the DSCC fumbled the ball.
Right. Joe, quick thought on that same issue? I mean, because Bill Clinton was one of these plays who played well in some of these crossover counties that were Republican dominant areas. Has that muscle memory been lost?
Well, I think that the ecosystem is different. We got stuff done because we could convince enough Republicans to come with us to get stuff done now. Now in the Republican Party, it's a sign of weakness to want to compromise and work with Democrats. So it's so much harder now to do that. I think the Democratic Party right now is a big tent. And looking at it, I think Simone's right, which is what we should take from this midterms is where our strengths are and where our weaknesses are and address both of those things. But clearly, there is a continuum of support among women, particularly black women, that we have to continue. But, young people are actually turning out in, much proportionally larger numbers is something that we have to, we've got to keep the momentum. Now, on the flip side, we're losing Hispanic voters, and we've got to figure out why and address that. But all of these things, I think the party, this is, I've been around this for 40 years. There are times when there are just, the differences are so fundamental, the party can't come together. We're in a relatively peaceful time in our party. There are lots of progressives, lots of moderates, but it doesn't look like the Republican Party looks right now, which are in camps that are at war.
We're really out of time. I was going to go to the thing about my executive producer, which you know well, is giving us the.
They're
like,
I
can't let you leave without asking Simone very rapidly. What do you think about the new leaders emerging in the House? Nancy Pelosi stepping down, Hakeem Jeffries and company coming up. How does that feel to you?
Look, I think it's great. As a young person who grew up in Democratic politics, I think it is amazing to see younger leaders step to the front, being bolstered by the elder leaders in the party. Speaker Pelosi wasn't pushed out. She left at her own behest and is standing there to support the next generation, as is Whip Clyburn. So I think it's amazing. I think that I have, just in the chatter over the last couple of hours, I've heard a lot of people question the ability of Hakeem Jeffries, right? He's untested. These are all things, words that they throw out for people that I don't know if we'd be talking about it if we were talking about a 42-year-old white man. So I'd just like to note that people should watch this next Congress. Obviously, Hakeem Jeffries has to win election from the caucus first. I think that that is not in question. Maybe the number 2 or 3 possibly is. But I'm excited to see what happens, and I'm excited to have Hakeem Jeffries come on my show and tell me about it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Simone Sanders and go ahead, Joe.
Steve, I just jump in on Hakeem. I think it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago. I got a call from somebody who was working with him or a friend saying, would you have dinner with him? And I went and I had dinner with him up at the Congressional Club or whatever it's called. And I remember going home and saying, I think I know who the next Speaker of the House is. I was that impressed with not only his grasp of politics and issues, but his ability to talk about it in a way that was so engaging that, sometimes we don't have in our party. So I couldn't be more excited for him. And, it should just be said that Nancy Pelosi is the best Speaker of the House in my lifetime, and I was alive for Tip O'Neill, and it's not even close.
Well, Semafor is going to work really hard to find his strengths and his flaws. So with that, Simone Sanders, Joe Lockhart, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, Simone, and thank you, Steve. Of course, please sign up for Principles if you haven't already in the room. Steve is going to harangue you afterwards, for sure. Well, we mentioned this earlier. We're now going to bring you a short video and take a moment to hear about the role of Congress in safeguarding news. Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota is the author of a bill called the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. It's an effort to protect and promote independent and local journalism in the era of social media. Steve had a chance to speak with her yesterday. Take a listen.
Senator Amy Klobuchar, thank you so much for joining us. You are the lead sponsor of the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. Describe to us what you're trying to achieve with this.
We have to have a thriving press. 1/3 of our newspapers are scheduled to shut down. They believe they're going to shut down. A number of them already have by 2025. That's unbelievable. This is getting at something that is really a threat to our democracy. We have lost so much in coverage on the local level that can never be brought back. And we want to stop the bleed. Right now, these large platforms, specifically Facebook and Google, I think Google in one quarter last year, $66 billion in advertising. What they have done is taken the money that used to go to the local content providers and put it into them. They're actually making money off snippets of the content, and the content providers are not being compensated. So what we're saying is, you guys, you have to come to the table, and you won't even return the calls of these news organizations. But they're supportive because they want to keep news going.
So this gives the small players some standing.
Medium size and small.
Some muscle.
Some muscle to be able to negotiate. And if they don't negotiate with them, it's a baseball-style arbitration. And it's a very specific thing. We know it worked in Australia.
And in Australia, the parliament has passed a groundbreaking law.
Under the country's new media code, tech companies will be forced to pay publishers for their content.
And remember that News Corp lobbied heavily for this law to be passed through Parliament because they know that money could be made.
About $200 million has now changed hands to news organizations, and that's exactly what we need to do. So we have a bipartisan bill, Senator Kennedy and myself, he's no flaming liberal. We got support in the committee of 15-7 vote to get it out of the Judiciary Committee, including support from Senator Grassley and Senator Graham. Senator Cruz supported the bill. All the Democrats supported the bill, and now it's headed to the Senate floor. I can't 100% say that every newspaper is going to be saved, but I know that what we've seen in Australia so far is very positive. And I know this isn't fair. And I'm the daughter of a reporter. And he interviewed everyone from Ginger Rogers to Ronald Reagan. He talked about the late nights and keeping a widow of a soldier who had died on the phone and feeling so horrible, but having to get her to talk about it. And at the end, he said, "Was it worth it?" And he said, "God, it was." Wow. And so that kind of spirit is my spirit when it comes to journalism. You know, good or bad in terms of how politicians come out in stories. If we didn't have journalism, we're not a democracy. And that's why I believe so strongly in this bill.
Well, for our last conversation, and it's gone by really quickly today, we're turning to a view from the White House and the role and responsibility of government and media to ensure a healthy democracy. Back from a busy week of global travel with President Biden, please welcome to the stage White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, and joining her in conversation, Semafor's executive editor, Gina Chua. Gina, over to you.
Well, thank you for joining us.
I had to remember where to sit. Hi, everybody.
Yes, it's complicated instructions. The far chair, the near chair, it's all. Let's talk about you. So, you're the first Black and first openly LGBT person to be the White House Press Secretary. What took so long? Why did it take so long?
Well, first, hi, everybody. Thanks for being out here on a Friday evening. I appreciate you all being here. Is this too loud? Is this okay?
They'll fix it.
Why did it take so long?
Yeah.
I can't answer that question. What I can answer is why it's important to have someone like President Biden in the administration. And I say this because me being at that podium was very purposeful. It was a decision that he made. It was an important decision to him as to who he believes has his voice, but also represents the American people. And it was, when you have that type of thoughtful thinking and idea of what you want your administration to look like and be, I think that's important. And I think it's important when we talk about getting out there, people getting out there, making their voices heard, and exercising their constitutional right to the sacred right to vote. I think all of those things matter, right? As you look at the way he has built his administration, and again, very purposeful, very thoughtful, very purposeful, and I'm grateful. I always, while today was a long day, it's been a long 20 months. Very long. I always remind myself how privileged and honored I am to be standing at that podium every day, to be traveling on Air Force One, to be on Marine One, to be sitting in the Oval Office and briefing the president or being part of a meeting. And so this is something that I just carry with myself all the time. It is a privilege, it is an honor, and I try to give it the respect that I can every day.
Let me get back to that a little bit about the voice and everything, but you just talked about your long day. And everybody knows you have an insane day, but I'd love to hear a little more. When does your day start? How do you get through all this?
So, I'm trying to think. So this week is a little off because we were in North Africa and in Egypt for COP27. Then we went to Cambodia for our US-ASEAN and East Asia Summit, so we did that. And then we went to Bali for the very consequential meeting that the president had with President Xi and also G20. And so we just got back, I can't even remember, today's Friday.
It's Friday.
You
can sleep in tomorrow.
We got back, I think, on midnight on Thursday. And we had left we left the Thursday prior. So it's been a long week. But normally, outside of traveling, my days, I wake up about 3:30, 3:45 in the morning. I go through all of like the evening network news. I start kind of reading the paper, all of the wires. You guys, congratulations. The tip sheets. And it just goes on from there. There's some podcasts I like to listen to. So there's this probably 2-hour process of my day. And then I leave my house, I don't know, around 6-ish. I go to work by 6:30. And then what's nice about it is, I'm a morning person, as you can see. But what's nice about it is I'm in the office by myself, unless our chief of staff, my assistant Robbie, is there, and I'm like, oh, Robbie was my peace of mind. He's probably laughing behind the wall here. But I have about 30 minutes to myself, some silence, where I get to kind of get my head together for the day. My first meeting is at 7:30. I have one at 7:45. I have one at 8 o'clock. I have one at 8:20. And then the prep starts. The prep process starts for the podium. So it is, it is a long day, and then I'm home. I try to get home in time for my daughter before she gets to bed.
And you do all this without coffee?
Without coffee? No, I don't drink coffee.
Okay, well, that's a prize there.
It's not anything that I miss because it's not ever anything that I consumed.
So let me come back to your notion about President Biden and you being the voice and the representative. Why doesn't the president give more interviews? He's given far fewer interviews than everybody else. What's the issue? Shouldn't it be his voice? Shouldn't he be selling his policies?
You know, I would say that, and I get the question, I would say that the president is out there almost every day, and he is talking about the issues that matter to the American people, whether today he talked about the economy, he talked about inflation, and talked about lowering costs for the American people and all the work that we've done. And many times he takes questions from the pool, the White House press corps, when he is in front of them. They shout questions, he takes them, and he's always willing to do that. He's always willing to have that back and forth. When we were in Asia, he did. I'm trying to think. He did a press conference. He was in front of the press about twice, and took questions. You know, I think it's just been a busy 20 months, and we've just been moving and moving and moving. This is a president who has taken such historical action and has done so much, more than easily argue, more than any modern day president. But we have a lot more time. We will continue to do interviews.
We would love to be. We'd love to be one of those people.
Yeah, there's something weird happening.
I know it is. This is.
They're giving us wireless.
Okay, they've given up. Okay.
Yeah. But no, but I do want to. He will do a lot more interviews. This has been an unprecedented 20 months, and he'll definitely get out there and do more interviews for sure.
Put us on the list.
I know. I hear you.
Right at the front.
Just skip you right to the top.
Well,
okay. Gotcha.
What media does he like? What does he consume? Who does he hang out with? We know he had the off-the-record meal with Tom Friedman, and can we get one of those? And can we have one of those where we can only write about the sinful chocolate milkshake?
We'll see. I mean, look, he consumes a lot of news. He reads the papers. He turns on the nightly news, evening news, and watches that. He watches cable in the morning as he's getting himself ready to come over to the Oval Office. He definitely has his finger on the pulse. I see him every day and talk through what's out there in the press and what's on people's minds, and he's pretty much has a good sense already of what's out there, what's being discussed.
So the First Lady gave an interview to Newsmax, and there's a raging debate, I think, at least on the left, about what are considered legitimate news organizations on the right, how much you should engage in. You've certainly had your share of sparring with and attacks by, say, Fox. I mean, would you be willing to go on Fox? Would you be, thinking about how to reach out to that part of the American public?
So if I remember correctly, the Newsmax interview, she was doing an event with a host, I believe, that's on Newsmax, and I believe it was an event on cancer, if I'm correct, and so that's how she ended up on Newsmax. Look, I think one of the things that we were going to talk about, or are going to talk about, is democracy and how important it is to be able to have that free press, independent press, and how critical it is to our democracy. It connects, it goes hand in hand. And I think the exercise of being at the podium every day and having, more than 50 reporters in the room from all stripes, right? Whether it is leans conservative, leans liberal, mainstream, whatever you want to call it. It is an exercise of democracy, right? It is an exercise of independent press. It is an exercise of free press. It is an exercise and opportunity for the White House to take questions, as I do, from the press, whether it's hard, whether it's an easy one to answer. And I think that's important. You have Fox right to my right, and I take questions from them almost every day. And there are others, Newsmax is in the room as well, further back. And there's, in between as well. And I think that is a process that is so important. That is a process as we talk about our democracy, as we talk about how we have to protect it, strengthen it, how we talk about how we have to protect journalists and make sure that they're able to do the job and allowed to do the job on behalf of the American people in this instance, it's important. So I think I do that. I think I already take questions from folks from all different types of publications, and I think that's important. That's important that I do that almost every day. And so I think that is an exercise that is critical and important, and I'm glad that in this administration we were able to bring that back in a much more daily kind of consumption, and also in a way that we want to make sure that we are respecting the press, and that's what we have made sure that we have done. That's something that the president wants us to do.
Wouldn't going on some of these outlets reach out to more of Americans who might not, say, believe the mainstream media or the left-leaning media, sort of being much more, doing interviews with them, going on their shows?
You talking about me in particular?
You or the administration in general?
I think the administration, especially our policy people, when you think about our National Economic Council, when you think about other policy folks within the administration, they are regularly on all of the networks that we're kind of alluding to here. They are on Fox regularly, they're on Bloomberg and MSNBC, CNN, and you see them just talking through the president's policy, what's happening, whether if he's talking about student loan, whether he's talking about what he's doing for the economy, whether he's talking about any new policy that matters to the American people. And we put them out there specifically because they are the experts and they understand how the policy the president just introduced or laid out or an executive order, how that works. And honestly, I think it's better to see them than to see me. But they're impressive. I think we have an impressive group that, again, they are on regularly laying out what we're doing, sharing our platform, talking about what is it that we're presenting is going to help the lives of the American people.
So you were talking about sort of keeping the press vibrant because it's important for democracy. Could we get that slide up with about the funding of journalism organizations? And just before, and you can see, well, you can't see very clearly. This is from the Knight Foundation, our friends at Gallup. And basically what it says is that most people believe that there should be commercial funding of news organizations. And we just saw Senator Klobuchar talk about the bill, wending its way through that would essentially, I guess, force news organizations to, and platforms to negotiate so there'd be more money. What's the administration's view on a bill like that and on just generally trying to keep news organizations well funded?
So one of the things that the president believes in competition, right? He talks about that, and he signed an executive order making sure that we do that, right? He believes in capitalism, but certainly he doesn't believe in taking advantage of it. And that's something that I actually talked about today in the briefing room. One of the things that the first piece of legislation that this president signed, which was the American Rescue Plan. The American Rescue Plan, as you all know, met a moment in the beginning of the administration when COVID was really just, as we know, ravaging the country. Businesses were closing down, about more than 100,000 businesses were shut down. You had schools majority of schools were shut down, and we wanted to make sure that we were getting people shots in arms, getting the vaccines to get things going back, to get the economy going back. There is a part of that piece of legislation that helps small businesses, gives them grant, reopens small businesses. And what we saw is, because of what we were able to do to small businesses, it actually helped local newspapers as well. If you think about advertisement, if you think about what are the things that local newspapers need to survive, so they benefited as well. So that's one thing that we were able to do, which is very important. we understand how important it is to have local news organizations. We understand how important it is to have those voices of journalists and making sure that information is being pushed out there. We believe sometimes the best way to get our information out there is going to local news, is going to regional news, because it goes right into the homes of Americans who turn on and listening to the evening news. So this is important. We're going to continue to work on this. We're going to continue to do the work that we need to make sure that they survive.
I'm told we're running out of time, and I'm going to sneak one question in. Don't kill me.
Okay. No, it's good.
Twitter.
No?
How concerned is the administration about this as a place of public discourse? I believe the president called it a platform that spews lies all around the world. And I think, I'm not sure how to describe what's going on there right now, but things are happening.
So we've all seen the reports. We're all watching closely, especially in the worlds that we're in. Can't really speak too much to it because it's kind of developing in front of our eyes, and so don't want to make any comments specifically on what's happening. But the president has talked about platforms more broadly. And how they're being used in a way to spew hate, how they're being used in a way to spew violence. And it is an incredibly dangerous time. It goes back to him talking about democracy, him talking about like where we are as a country. And it goes into the reason why he even ran for president. If you think about 2017, if you remember what happened in Charlottesville, saw the hate, even violence, and how horrific that was. And he talked about soul of a nation. All of that is connected. All of that is connected as to where we are. And he is an optimist. He will say that. He has said that many times in the last couple of days. He believes that we are better than that. He believes that we can heal and get to the other side of it. But we have to fight for it. We have to fight for our democracy. We have to fight to make sure that we live up to what we can be. One of the things I just wanted to say before we ended this is, as we all know, Speaker Pelosi stepped down from leadership. And I was listening to what she was saying, and I was listening to, and as we all were watching her speech yesterday, and she talked about essentially how when she looks at the Capitol, it is a temple of democracy, and how important the Constitution is. And those are the things that we should be fighting for. Those are the things that are so important and critical. And listening to her, and she talks about what it means to be an elected official, right? What it means that you're protecting and fighting for it. Yes, it's your district. Yes, it's the American people. But there's something kind of bigger than all of us. And if we do not fight for that, who are we going to be as a country? And so those are the things that have been on my mind the last 24 hours.
Good words to end on, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne and Gina. Well, that brings tonight's program to a close. Thank you to C-SPAN for taking us live this evening. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the Knight Foundation, for Gallup, our wonderful guests this evening. And thank you for spending your Friday night with us. If you are staying with us, we've got a reception just outside. I'm told there's some fancy food and drink. Great reception to Steve Clements. And for those watching at home, sorry you're about to get major FOMO. If you didn't get the Twitter ads the first time around, please sign up for semafor.com, and we'll see you next time. Thank you all.